Same old, same old.
Yep. Well, welcome to EMS Office Hours. I'm Jim Hoffman.
I'm Josh Knapp. Good morning.
Good morning. Josh, we're just waiting for hopefully Dave's going to pop in here. I know he said he was going to join us, so hopefully he will come on in the video here in a second. But while we're waiting, I figured I would just talk about the new fee I'm charging for the show.
The fee you're charging for the show? Does that mean we finally get paid? Or we double our salaries?
No money. I just asked the fee I ask, guys, is just to please go ahead and if you get any value from the show at all, or a chuckle here and there, or maybe just kind of make you stop and think for a second of some of the things we talk about here on the show, just share it with one or two other people that you think might also enjoy it. It really means a lot. It helps us with listenership, and helps us just kind of build, the show in the background that nobody ever gets to see. So, and of course, like the show, smash that little likey button, heart button, or whatever, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook and whatnot, so we can continue to grow the show a little bit. We've got about 6,000 or so listeners that are subscribed. Of course, the reality is that not everybody listens to it they're not listening to it every time. So those that are subscribed, just like YouTube, right? You get people have YouTube channels and it's like, oh, I got 40,000 subscribers. Yeah, but maybe 1,000 of them actually watch the videos every week. So, so just do me a favor, guys, if you can take a time out after the show, maybe, and just kind of share it with somebody, it'd be great. And
so you've done some stats on the show.
Yeah, I always try to look here and there and see, the subscriber count and the listener count. But
so 6,000.
The accuracy is always a little off because you get the mobile versions that don't always get sort of pulled into the stats on the different platforms and whatnot. So I take it all with a grain of salt.
So we could have 10,000 listeners.
Yeah, I go more by emails that I get and messages in the comments of the shows and all that type of stuff, a little bit more than I do the actual numbers. So hopefully Dave's gonna pop in here with us, Josh. If not, that's cool. I mean, listen, maybe something came up, he couldn't join us. I do know that there's a new Google Chrome extension, and maybe he's having an issue because of that. But just the one thing, and I kind of sent a couple emails out on this to people.
That's right, you did. I've had an insane week. I'm really sorry.
Yeah,
did not read the link.
We've talked about this before. I'm going to say a few times, but talking about using lights and sirens on ambulances, and I came across this article that says that using them may do more harm than good, and this was actually something that was brought up, and it was by a guy that I know from my days in North Carolina. He was a fellow there, and then became a paramedic, and now he does a lot of the sort of the back end operations of the agency that I work for, and talks a lot about the benefits of lights and sirens. And I'll put a link to this article in the show notes so people can check that out after the show and maybe come up with their own little ideas on that. My take on it, I guess maybe you have the same feeling, but my thing is lights and sirens. Over the years, I've realized that most of the calls that you respond to don't really require lights and sirens, and there's a very small percentage that do. And I think in the article we talked about maybe 4 to 5% of calls, or 1 out of every 14 calls, actually end up needing a lights and sirens response, because of what they find once they get on scene, right?
Right.
But on the flip side of that, and some of the comments I've seen that people have written, based on when other people have read this article, is the fact that we don't know what's on scene, right? A lot of times we're going by very limited dispatch information, and sometimes the dispatch information is just based upon a card reader that the dispatch is going through, different steps that they're going through when they're dispatching a call and trying to find out what's going on with a patient, and I think it ends up sort of, I don't know. I think that if you end up responding to a call, let's say you go cold based on the stats and the the research of 911 responses, how many were actually needed that lights and sirens response. It sounds like, oh, you don't really have to go lights and sirens for majority of the calls that we do, right? But I know that I've responded to calls, non-lights and sirens, or a call that was a non-emergent type thing, and then you get there and you're almost surprised because now you get there and it's a critical patient waiting for you, right?
Right.
And there is that danger of saying not responding lights and sirens to calls. I know that there's places that do a thing where they don't even dispatch ambulances, lights and sirens to car accidents unless the fire department or police department get there on scene and determine that there are actual patients there.
Right.
It used to be car wreck, fire goes, EMS goes, police goes, and then you sort it out once you get there. And now it's more of, okay, so many car wrecks are just fender benders. There's no injuries, there's no complaints, and you're sending an ambulance, lights and sirens to a car wreck to find patients that don't, or people that don't need an ambulance. So they've sort of transitioned into that response for those type of calls where if it's a car wreck, they don't dispatch the ambulance until fire gets there or police get there and determine that there's actually somebody with a complaint, right? That makes them, and then that makes them a patient. Whether they refuse when you get there, or, they do a refusal, or they change their mind while you're in the way, or whatever. So I'm just wondering, and a lot of things in EMS, and I know you get a lot of pushback on this, is the difference between the whole evidence-based stuff, research-based things, versus almost a reality of the job, And you can go, a lot of it, you can use evidence-based and it makes sense and it works. But when you are some things that you respond to, and like in this case, there's a reality to it. So you might have the evidence base that says, okay, we're not going to respond lights and sirens, but then the experience providers out there might say, well, I don't know, I worked at a place that didn't respond lights and sirens, and then I get there and the patient is unconscious, or the patient is, having an MI, or whatever the case may be.
Right. A couple of things in response, because you had a real part question there.
I had a whole week to think about this, so
yeah. Well, but this is something. Wait a second, hold on. We've been you're bouncing around is very accurate, I would say, for you. We have, let's keep in mind there are a lot of factors going on here. One is, the historical aspect of, certainly you are a dinosaur of EMS. You're not currently doing it anymore, but you had a good 30 years of doing it. I had 20 years of doing it. I'm not doing it right this moment either. But, in back in the good old days, they really didn't have the data, did they? They had some data, but they didn't have that precise, time on, time off jobs that we have today with GPS tracking and computer aided dispatch, right? So we've got all that. So there's that
A lot more,
Anecdotal.
I guess, accountability, for our times on scene and response times, and like you said,
Yeah,
GPS.
yeah, but it's also that basic number of when we got to the job, what the job level was, what the priority of the call was, and when we left the job, and the type of job that was found, right? You have that real empirical evidence right now. We were really running on anecdotal evidence, our gut. Are we, sometimes we'd go and feel like it took us forever, but we
Yeah.
had that. Those are the jobs that, like our spidey sense was tingling and saying, this isn't what it's showing on the KDT. This isn't what it's showing in the dispatch information.
Right.
We've got something, we've got something worse. So we've got that. We also have, that historical evidence of ambulance wrecks and accidents on the way, responding lights and sirens,
Sure.
and those sort of things sort of make a more permanent embedded more permanently in our minds and memories because they're more eventful, than just a regular. Well, I got there, the guy was having an MI, I brought him to the hospital.
Yeah.
With that said, it was always suspected that the majority of lights and sirens calls were not necessary and really didn't save you any time. Now, anybody who's driven through holiday traffic in New York City or any major metropolitan area and tried to respond to a call knows that if they were not going lights and sirens, it would take them, it may have taken them, look, we have supposedly an 11-minute response time or something like that. I don't know what the current stats are to average calls, but, in that holiday traffic, that rush hour traffic, we would get, an extend, show me extended, type of calls.
Right.
But, the reality of the situation is that it would have taken 4 or 5 times as long. And that just because you're behind the wheel and your area. So lights and sirens are definitely a benefit under certain circumstances. The question that we're facing here is, how do we filter out when it's really appropriate to be using lights and sirens instead of just saying, it's a priority 2 call, lights and sirens, priority 3 call, lights and sirens, priority 6 call, no lights and sirens. I think that's actually changed. It's priority 7 or above. It's no lights and sirens in the city. So then, how do we look at that? How do we mash that information and filter it out so we can get what the real truth is? And I think right now, we're still, even though we have all this empirical evidence, we're still relying on the provider's gut instinct to say, was it worth it? Was it not worth it?
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, one thing that's important, like you mentioned too, Josh, is that you, as the provider, the one out on the street, the one doing the calls, right? Not the one collecting research, not the one sitting behind a desk someplace. That certain times of the day, right? Your area, and that, okay, they're giving me this call and they're saying don't run lights and sirens. It's going to take me 15, 20 minutes, to get to a call. And looking at the article I mentioned, they do mention about, they're not telling units to just drag ass and just take your time and don't be in a big hurry to get there. They're saying, drive, with
due
traffic.
regard.
And yeah.
Due regard.
So there is that, but there's 2 things in the article that I want to mention, and one is, and you kind of touched on it, is this idea of the wake crashes, which is that thing where you're going lights and sirens, you push yourself through an intersection, and then behind you now there's
an
a car
idiot.
wreck,
Yep.
And so now you've got a car wreck that you've left behind you because somebody wasn't paying attention. They weren't, pulling to the right that they should have. They weren't, yielding to the ambulance, and they get into a wreck. And now that's another accident that's behind you. And of course, in addition to that, is the potential of accidents that could happen to you as the driver yourself getting into an accident, right? And then now that is now a sort of a snowball effect. Now,
Jesus.
now your unit out of service, you're not getting to the call, and I got to dispatch another unit to the same call because you were going licensed sirens, and maybe it wasn't necessarily, needed. I mean, for me, I know that I've been involved, and I've had the experience of that wake effect where I've been going licensed sirens to a call, and I see in my mirror as I'm going that there was a wreck behind me. You know what I mean?
Right. But we didn't even track that. I mean, that has to be a completely new, and that can be, now that they're geolocating, all of these incidents, they have cameras and stuff, they can start attributing those fender benders, those wrecks, those, whatever, go up the scale to pedestrian struck, right? Yeah. All of that can happen when somebody is being irresponsible behind an emergency vehicle. I mean, we have those laws that are never enforced, of don't tailgate an emergency vehicle. Don't use it. I mean, how many times have you gone through rush hour traffic and had a line of cars behind you? Yeah. Right? So, I mean, that's another potent piece of data that can now be attached to the response that was never a component before. It was something anecdotal. We could look in our rearview mirror and say, that idiot, Yeah.
Like I said, it's you don't know, you're driving the ambulance. You can't anticipate other drivers slamming on brakes.
Yeah, but wait. There's also the famous brake test. I mean, it made it to TV in the episodes that, showed, like 911 response. I don't remember the show I had seen it on, but this guy did a brake test. The guy ran into the back of the ambulance, and then the guy took off. The ambulance took off, which was an insane scenario. However, in real life, we all know that people have done brake tests, Yeah. I won't.
They got it from
somewhere, right? So I mean, it's a complicated formula. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, I mean, listen, I feel like there's so many different ways you can come at this, this whole discussion here, that I don't think we could even cover it in one podcast. I mean, there's the element as well. And one thing that the article mentions too is about there's so many calls that you respond to, lights and sirens, and then there's only a smaller percentage of those, right, that require lights and sirens during transport.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Which is a whole nother thing. Because on top of that, and one thing that I do agree with, and this is something that is that the days of diesel administration to just get the patient and tear ass off to the hospital, are so over. EMS, we go through so many, hundreds and thousands of hours of training and retraining and, continued education, that we should be doing things in the back of the ambulance that benefit the patient more than just speed getting to the hospital.
That's a great point, because
we bring, the whole idea, you used to always hear people, we bring the ER to you, right? And in a lot of ways, back in the day, that wasn't necessarily true, right? In the beginning of EMS, it was just, you call, we haul, and, that's it. But then over the years, it's come to the point where we're giving medications and we're stabilizing airways, and we're all these different things that we're doing that a lot of times it doesn't benefit the patient, to do that. Because there's a comment in the article that I read where somebody was talking about the fact that, when you're, especially if you're only a two-man crew, if you're in the back and your partner's driving licensed sirens, you end up being limited a lot of times to what you can do for the patient because of the speed, the stopping, the licensed sirens, the sound that's drowning, and you can't communicate with partners. You can't get to patients, and then you get people say, well, you got to wear your seatbelt in the back of the ambulance and how you getting to patients when you got a seatbelt on, how you get to equipment with seatbelts on. And you go on licensed sirens, that risk of the ambulance getting to a wreck with the patient in the back and you in the back becomes, even higher.
Right. And one of the criticisms,
a lot of times for me, I feel like, the whole thing of responding licensed sirens, for me, a lot of it is more responding to the hospital decision of going licensed sirens is more, important of a decision for the crew to make than getting to the call licensed sirens. Once you get to the call and you assess and you see what's going on, you can make a decision at that point. Okay, do I need to go license sirens to the hospital, or can I treat and transport and do what I can do as an EMS professional for the patient en route to the hospital? Rather than just going, okay, I'm going to rush into the hospital, to half the time sit and wait for a triage nurse to get to you, right? And then all treatment stops when you walk into the ER bay half the time.
Sometimes, right. I mean, just adding on to that and bringing a little history in. We've been doing this show well over 10 years now, right? And one of the first shows that we ever had were, that conversation of, do we really need lights and sirens? Are lights and sirens appropriate on every call? Are lights and sirens appropriate at all? So this is a reoccurring issue. And I have a feeling that even when we go forward to the days of battery operated flying ambulances, we're still going to be saying, are lights and sirens appropriate? Yeah. Bob had a excellent point earlier in the show of, lights and sirens don't give you right of way. And, there are some basics about driving with due regard, Bob, that, we're going to assume that the technician is following. Right. Yeah. But you also brought up a very important point, Jim, is like we bring more medicine to you now than we ever have. Even with BLS, even with basic life support services, they, back in my day when we started, we had to call for albuterol.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was a new thing. EpiPens were just
more and more drugs are available to paramedics on standing orders.
Right.
And EMT crews now are able to give drugs and a lot of times even advanced airways, and so there's a lot more going on.
I remember when I first became a paramedic that I got sort of lectured on, listen, you're not supposed to bolt off on the scene when you have a patient anymore. When you have a patient, you have to do your paramedic thing, which is assess, diagnose, treat, right? But then, then you get that conflicting thing of, well, you're not supposed to be waiting on scene either. You're supposed to be doing this en route. And I don't care what you say. They haven't improved the ride in ambulances so much that you can palpate, that you can auscultate a blood pressure at 30 miles an hour, or above.
Well, I think part of that too, Josh, is it goes in line with a lot of agencies that put restraints on crews that say you can only be on scene X amount of minutes, and then you need to be transporting if it's a sick call, if it's an MI, if it's a stroke, if it's a trauma. They have different guidelines of how fast you need to get off scene and then do everything else en route to the hospital. Right?
Well, you've heard the stuff about, when you have a cardiac arrest and you regain a pulse, you have to transmit a 12 lead to the receiving ED, right? I think that's a pretty big standard across the country now. I mean, it was
Yeah.
really,
A lot of
really in
places
New
too
York.
now with the cardiac arrest, if you do get ROSC with that, they make you stay on scene a certain amount of time before you start moving the patient, so that
Right.
for the chance of, unfortunately, that if you do lose pulses again, now you're not transporting a dead body to the hospital. You actually do have ROSC, and you're bringing a viable resuscitated patient back to the ER, rather
Tell
than
me
moving
one
them right.
provider
Oh,
that
we got
does.
pulses back, let's go. And then by the time you get to the truck, the pulses are gone.
Right.
And you don't get them back, and now you're bringing a dead body to the hospital, right?
Right.
So,
Right, which and that's the wisdom behind the idea of the bitch was, I got Rosk, why can't I go? Now I have to do a 12 lead. Well, exactly that, because you may not be, that might be just, the body responding and not responding in a permanent way.
right,
So they want
the
that
epi
12
the
lead.
epi gave the heartbeat
Right.
back, right? It's not really
Yep.
the heart itself or the patient coming back itself. One other thing, Josh, I want to touch on, and this article doesn't really put into it, but this is something that I was thinking of as well, in my pea brain. But is the fact that there's also the public perception, right, of what we're doing. They call 911. They're expecting that ambulance to pull up in front of their house with the lights and sirens on, right? Because
Right.
it's their emergency.
Right.
They know, dispatch, your partner, years of experience, hours and hours of research doesn't take into effect what the patient or the family, right, who is the customer, the client, or whatever, expects when they dial 911. They're almost expecting that ambulance to pull up lights and sirens, in front of their house, right? The same goes when you're transporting them, right? If you get there and the patient is not a critical patient, and under your protocols or your assessment, you decide, okay, I'm going to take it to the hospital, and we're not going to go lights and sirens because your injury or illness doesn't require lights and sirens response to the hospital. How many times do you get people going, why aren't the lights on? Why aren't the sirens on? Right? Because the public is expecting that response, and they're almost upset that you're not going lights and sirens to the hospital with their loved one, especially when they're behind you, following in the car, and they're looking at you like, what the hell's going on? I could have took them to the hospital in my car. And you're like, well, yeah, exactly. You could have took them to the hospital in your car, right?
But you called an ambulance.
Almost like you teach them a lesson, but you're not. You're just transporting what's appropriate for that patient.
You're doing the safe. Because every time you take every time you get in and put the key into the ambulance, as the driver of that ambulance, you were responsible for the safety of everybody on board that ambulance.
Yeah.
So, that is something that will never, ever go away. But perception is something that, again, for a decade, we've been talking about this. It's not only the perception that comes down when somebody dials 911 and gets an ambulance. How many times have you gone into the ED with a sick patient and the doctor looked at you and said, well, why didn't you bring them sooner? Let me schedule this, doc. Let me call in advance and find out if they've been abusing drugs for the last 5 years, or a severe diabetic and they just ate an Entenmann's cake. I don't have an answer for that. I can't. I'm here and that's something interesting that is also a part of how the public is viewed. The truth of the matter is we cannot be proactive. The only place we can be proactive is in our training, is in checking the rig, is in making sure we're stocked up for, whatever emergencies we have. But after that, everything we do is reactive. So there is no planning in advance, and that's what our job is. Our job is, to train for the event, and that's our responsibility to be a good provider. But once that happens, once we step in and log in and get ready for that first call, it's all reactive from there, baby.
Yeah. I mean, I know that, even we talk about bringing, the hospital to the patient and so much more that we can do nowadays. And when you talk about this argument about not responding licensed sirens too, is the fact that the dispatchers now even try to do more care over the phone than they ever did, right?
Right.
They're coaching people through CPR. They're coaching people through stopping, major bleeding, positioning a patient, for an airway if they're unresponsive, all this type of stuff.
And
So,
statistically, that saves lives.
right. So there is that going on as well. And I think that in a lot of, I don't know about every system, but I know there are systems that the dispatcher stays on with the patient or the caller longer than they used to in the past. So when you're responding, if they do dispatch you as a non-emergent call, as they're on with the caller, with the patient, and they continue doing sort of the phone assessment, right? They can see that maybe something's happening that now might require you to make it a licensed sirens response. I've been on those responses too, where I'm going, it's a non-critical call. And then during the ride, all of a sudden now, it's a Charlie or Delta dispatch now. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you end up now, okay, now I'm turning the lights on because something happened from the initial dispatch to when you're going that the dispatcher gleaned from the caller or the family member or whatever to determine that now it's time to maybe speed it up a little bit. Like I said, Josh, there's lots of ways to come at this, and I think a big issue of it is too is that you do have agencies in the country that try to lead the way when it comes to EMS care, when it comes to things like this, and adjusting their responses and stuff, right? And it's the type of thing that other agencies don't do it, right? They're doing the old-fashioned way. Everything goes licensed sirens, because there's also the fear of the litigation fear that you don't go licensed sirens. You get some lawyer gets a hold of it and go, well, why didn't you go licensed sirens? And then there's that whole thing that has to get proven and get adjusted and get validated why the ambulance didn't go licensed sirens to a particular call that had a negative effect, an outcome for that patient, right? So, and some places, agencies, they're smaller and they don't have the ability to, back up their policies, with legally or with research, and they rather just keep doing it the way they've been doing it.
Well, yeah. And what happens is they take, as the information gets, compacted and the numbers get crunched and the data comes out, the larger scale operations trim the way that they respond to lower their liability,
Sure.
to raise successful patient outcome, to do these things. And, and that's just based off of sheer, data, which makes articles like this, a little troublesome because they're taking a paper thin slice out of the whole problem.
Oh, that's why I said
I have an interesting question for you.
Yeah, a lot of the data and the stats in the article makes sense, and it's hard to argue with it. But when you see other, the point of view from providers that are commenting on the article, who talk about things that we've been talking about, right? You don't know what you're going to find when you get there. I've responded to non-licensed sirens, and I get in the patient unresponsive or even dead or whatever. It's hard because, like I say, there's that reality-based medicine versus research-based, medicine, right? And again, people, oh, that's a dogma or whatever, and BLS before ALS, all that stuff, but I get that, and I'm not against the research, and I'm for not responding for the license, responding licensed sirens to every single call, but I think that it just, you can't absolve that thought process and say that that's a blanket thing, because there's a lot of other
Well,
things that we've been talking about today, I think, that kind of fall into
let
place with that,
let
which
me
is
throw something at
experience,
you.
which is experience of providers and actual outcomes of patients,
Let me throw this at you. There are also things that the municipality can do in terms of you know uh, in terms of their responses. I mean, how many times have you been dispatched to a call where somebody hasn't been seen for a few days, and it's a cardiac, you're dispatched as a cardiac arrest call when clearly it was
wide awake.
cardiac arrest. No, it was cardiac arrest a week ago, or flip that to the wide. Yes, they're wide awake, and I didn't call an ambulance.
Yeah.
So, you have those two parts, and it's very difficult for the municipalities to deal with it. Now, pulling in something that you and I have both spoken about in the recent past is the advent of AI and the ability uh, for us to see beyond the numbers, so to speak. So you not only have the statistics of what an average call would be, but now you can mix that in, hopefully, eventually, with specific patient information: who lives at that house, how many times have they been to the hospital, how many
Yeah.
times have they been to the doctor, what are they being treated for, what medicines are they on. So, and some people watching this will go, oh, that's going to violate HIPAA and all of these aspects. But, we're talking about like a
All they
new
dispatch
era.
calls based on this cry wolf thing, right? The patients
Right,
that call all the time, and it's always non-emergent until that one time, where it is, right?
right, right. But what do we do about that? We always treat that call as if it was the first time. We don't look at, we as providers, oh yeah, we've been to this address 1,000
Right.
times. It's Mrs. Murphy.
Yeah.
Her gout is acting up again.
Yeah.
So we as providers know that when we know an area and the like. But now I'm talking about, bringing in more patient information, more knowledge, and being able to crunch that and compute that to really determine, to the point that we will eventually have, you know, looking for the word, but proactive calls where it's like, hey, we're going off and Jim, you've been treated now for this heart condition for multiple years. We're predicting actually that you're probably going to have a heart attack real soon. So we're going to come in and get you and say, hey, you know what? Come on into the hospital because you need treatment now. You need a catheterization.
Well, that's
You're
part of the
probably more
whole. I mean,
blocked.
that's part of the benefit.
AI is going to do that.
It's also the benefit of the community paramedicine programs that are out there too, that try to preempt the 911 calls for these patients as well, right? Checking up on them, following up, to kind of eliminate that 911 response, where if you get the community paramedic gets there and feels that the patient needs to be transported to the hospital, they can call an ambulance to respond, that way. I mean, listen, Josh, I don't want to go on and on, but I mean, there's so many different facets of this that we haven't even touched on. Even the fact that you get, areas that use the fly car type response, where they get a paramedic and a fly car responds, and based upon the assessment of the paramedic, depends upon whether or not the ambulance responds, lights and sirens.
Well,
right?
I wanted to get in, just for the
You know.
discussion and for future discussions, because I know we're both excited about this technology. I mean, you and I have talked offline about it. And I think it's going to be something, you heard it here first, guys. This is the show that you heard it here first, that, not only is AI changing the world, but it's going to change how we respond to jobs.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. And don't forget, if you're a member at turbomedic.com, you have the new Turbomedic AI engine inside Turbomedic that can help you with your study and
You're grinning,
knowledge
but it's
out of
true.
it.
It's
Yeah.
really,
I
it's
have to do
a
a shameless
different.
plug because that was something that took me a while to implement into the membership site. So it does, and I'm getting a lot of feedback from people telling how useful it is that once they're in the membership site and they're getting the content within there, if they can't find something or something comes up that's like a sidebar of what they're studying for, they can just use that AI engine inside TurboMedic and find what they want real quick.
Listen, TurboMedic is a great program. I've used it every time I've had to recert, every time I've had to, retest and stuff like that. With the AI, it's going to be helpful. I can't wait until it starts to get into predictive teaching where it says, hey, Josh, you're a little weak on this spot, this subject. You're way strong on this. We don't have to test you anymore on this. Let's move on to this. And hey, here are a couple of links to read up on.
Yeah,
and,
that's a good point there, that someday it'll come to that, so people won't have to sit there and struggle on figuring out whether they're weak on a subject or not. Well,
what I like? Wait a second. You know what I really like about TurboMedic? That a lot of these other programs, and there's not a lot, but there's a few other programs that sort of go against it, and say they do the same thing. But the reality is, you and I have known each other for a long time. You were involved in EMS for a long time before that. This is something of your baby that you have been developing over 30 years of experience and over 20 years of, implementation. It's a robust platform to learn the details of EMS, to do well on testing, to get the national registry. And this isn't just a plug because you and I have known each other and we're friends. This frickin' program has saved my butt more than once. And it's up to date, and it's a real foundational learning tool. So, that I think sets TurboMedic apart.
Yeah. All right, Josh, let's end it there because my dog started barking like crazy in the background for some reason. So they must see something outside in the yard that
they're protecting you from a plastic bag.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll end it there. Again, I'll put the link to that article in the show notes. We might revisit this maybe another time if something else comes up on this, and maybe get David on it too and get his point of view on some of the things we talked about. So, all right, Josh, that's it. As always, Jim. I am Jim Hoffman.
Josh Knapp.
Stay safe.